In this lecture, we're going to take a look at a type of machine called a lever, and the lever is going to be a very effective tool or model to understand and analyze, at least statically, different elements of the human organism. And so a lever is just defined as a simple machine defined by a rigid bar and a point or axis of rotation. And so the components of a lever include the actual lever itself, which is the rigid body. This is a body that does not deform, it doesn't bend. There's a fulcrum, and the fulcrum is a knife edge point about which the lever is balanced or pivots, and we'll see lots of examples of that here shortly. And then we have two or more forces applied to the lever, and these forces will induce the lever to undergo a rotation, and the reason it's able to rotate is because of the fulcrum. The other concept we're going to introduce here is something called a torque or moment of force, and this simply refers to the rotational or twisting effect of one applied force. So if a system, such as a lever, has 5 forces applied to it, then there are 5 moments of force or 5 torques, that each of which is generated from the application of each of those 5 forces. There's a concept that we'll address much later called a bending moment, but a bending moment is not going to be an element of understanding a lever. And a bending moment is a tendency of a force to deform a structure or to cause it to bend. But in a rigid segment analysis, which is what we're going to focus on here in this unit, the bending moment is not something that we are going to consider. Another concept here is called a moment arm, and so when you see the term moment arm, think about a moment of force, that tendency of something to rotate, and the moment arm is a distance measure. Specifically, it's a perpendicular distance between the line of action of a force and the point of rotation. Introduced a little bit earlier is this force called a reaction force, and this is a force that occurs as a reaction when you bring two physical elements together. For the lever, the reaction force occurs at the point of rotation where the fulcrum is located, and in this case the fulcrum or the reaction force is going to constrain the lever to rotations only. In other words, it's going to constrain translations. The lever will not slide, but it will the only motion in the lever is a rotation around the fulcrum or the axis of rotation. And the equation for the moment of force is just simply the moment of force for a particular force will equal the applied force, and in our first example that will be a force in the directed along the y direction, times the distance of that applied force Fy that is perpendicular. So what you see here in the superscript is a symbol that indicates perpendicular, and in the subscript this is the distance specific to the force that's inducing a particular rotation or moment. Now here we have at the very top a complex system. We got two kids sitting on a seesaw, but if we want to analyze this statically, we begin by modeling this complex looking picture into something that's a little bit more simplified. Now, if we zero in on the fulcrum here, the fulcrum is that point around which the actual lever will rotate, and one of the questions here with the fulcrum is it strong enough to support the lever and the riders? So will the fulcrum collapse under the weight of the lever and the riders? the weight of the lever and the riders here is supported by the reaction force, and that prevents the bar from falling to the ground, provided that the materials that went into constructing the fulcrum are strong enough to generate that reaction force. So we're going to simplify this complex picture with a model of this. And so we model the system, and we have a rigid bar representing the lever, and we have the fulcrum representing that platform here, that a pillar around which rotation occurs. So I'm going to represent the child here on the left hand side with a force, and this force is the weight of the child, and the weight is always directed vertically downward. And I'm going to label this as F1. You could have also labeled this as W1. On the right hand side, I'm going to represent the weight of this child here with F2. So the subscript always indicates the specific force applied back to the original problem. Now this force here will induce a rotation that we call a moment of force, and we give that a label in the subscript, and then the subscript we would just label that the moment due to F1, and that's going to be equal to the magnitude of F1 times its perpendicular distance, and that perpendicular distance is how far the point of application is, or the line of action, to the point of rotation. And likewise on the left hand side, the moment induced by the second force, we have that as a subscript label, is equal to the magnitude of F2 times how far F2 is applied away from that point of rotation. And before we move on, there are three classes of levers that I'd like to define at this point. The first type is called a first class lever. Now in all of our examples here, the lever will be considered to be in equilibrium, which means that it is static, it's not moving. And in order for that to exist, the moment of the first force has to be equal to the moment generated by the second force. And to express this with an equation of equilibrium, we will use our sum of the moments of force, however many there may be acting on this. It will only represent two forces. That will equal 0. So the 0 indicates that there's no angular acceleration taking place. So here's our simplified first class lever. We have our fulcrum. And for the first class lever, the applied forces are both going to be in the same direction, but on opposite sides of the fulcrum. So here we have F2 on the right hand side, and so F2 is just represented by a weight, and that's always directed downward. And at a right angle to this force vector, if we follow that back to the fulcrum, that is our distance. That's our perpendicular distance. On the left hand side, here we have our first force, which is called F1, and it has a perpendicular distance away from the point of rotation. An example of a first class lever in the body is what's called the atlanto-occipital joint. The first cervical vertebrae of the human spine is called the atlas, and on top of the atlas sits the human skull, or rather the occiput portion of the human skull. And the nature of this interaction is such that the joint will allow the head to nod yes and no. Rotation occurs at the joint below this. But if we just focus on the atlanto-occipital joint, here we see represented at the joint is our fulcrum, the point about which the head would rotate forward or rotate towards the posterior side of the body. Now the weight of the head can be centered at approximately this point, and this is to the right or anterior to the atlanto-occipital joint. Now because the weight of the head is anterior to the joint, the weight will tend to cause the head to rotate in an anterior or forward direction. But to remain static, there has to be a force to counteract that. And that force is generated by the head extensor muscles that run along the spine and attach to the base of the cranium. Now, once again, we have a complex system, but to represent this system in a much more simplified manner, here we have our first class lever. We know it's first class because the applied forces are on opposite sides of the fulcrum. And when those forces are on opposite sides, they have to be in the same direction to maintain equilibrium. This force here on the left-hand side is not perfectly vertical, and that's okay because it's not representing a weight. It represents the muscles that are counterbalancing the weight, and those muscles come down or come inferior from the skull at a particular angle. And so we would replicate that on our free body diagram. And we would just give those labels, and I'm just going to label this as F1 or F2. The next type of lever that I'm going to focus on here is what's called a second class lever. And so the second class and third class levers are represented by the fulcrum being at one end of the lever that you see right here. So second and third class have the one thing in common where both forces are on the same side. In the second class lever, we have the weight of the lever represented here with this vector at the center of mass. And this weight vector has a particular distance from the fulcrum here. And always remember that this has to be a perpendicular distance. The other force that exists here is on the opposite side, or is on the distal side of the weight vector, and it's the furthest one from the fulcrum. So I'm just going to label this one F1, and I'm going to label this F2. So the second class lever is defined by the weight, or in this case I labeled it F2, being positioned between a counterbalancing external force and the fulcrum. And an example of a second class lever in the body, as we can see here, is a person standing, and they perform a standing plantar flexion or a heel raise. And to do this, the plantar flexor muscle group, mainly the gastrocnemius muscle and the soleus muscle, have to be active to generate this motion. So here we have the fulcrum, which represents the point of rotation, the contact between the person's forefoot and the ground. Now, we know that the weight of the body passes anterior to, in this case, the lateral malleolus, but is passing on the same side as the force that is generating the motion, and both of these forces are on the same side of from the fulcrum. And when you have the forces on the same side of the fulcrum, the forces have to act in the opposite direction. So this force here, generated from the plantar flexor muscles, is going in the opposite direction. Now I have it at an angle here because we have to draw it through where the actual muscle tissue is, but the body weight vector is always going to be oriented in a vertical direction. So we're just going to represent this as F1 and F2. Here I highly simplified the free body diagram and put F1 perfectly vertical, but I could have changed this angle slightly to better reflect the plantar flexor muscles. The third type of lever, and this is one that's very common in the human body, particularly with our extremities, is the third class lever. So once again we have our fulcrum, and we have our two forces on the same side of the fulcrum, but are acting in opposite directions. So in this case, we have force 1, which is located at a distance that's much greater than the distance of force 2 and the fulcrum. An example of a third class lever in the body is elbow flexion. So here we see the person performing an elbow flexion, and the elbow would be considered as the fulcrum. Now we know to do this, the biceps brachii, brachialis, or just more collectively, the elbow flexor muscles will generate an elbow flexion rotation. And we know that those muscles have an attachment on the proximal portion of the forearm, just distal to the elbow, and have a vector oriented through the actual muscles. Now, the weight of the forearm and hand is represented at the center of mass of the forearm and hand, and we would just draw that vector in the same manner, which is oriented perfectly vertical and pointing downwards. Now the free body diagram on the bottom is a highly simplified model of this situation here, where our fulcrum represents the elbow. The first force here, and I'm counting the numbers from the distal end towards the fulcrum, F1, represents the weight of the forearm and hand, and in this case F2 represents the vector, the force vector of the elbow flexor muscles. And as we saw on the previous example for a second class lever, I highly simplified F2. I just drew it perfectly vertical, but if we want to make our free body diagram a little bit more realistic to our real life situation, then I could have kept the point of application but just rotated this vector to better replicate the true direction of the elbow flexor muscle force vector. So this ends this portion of our unit on statics and lever.